Good morning, everybody. In making sense of why it is that we're beginning this semester looking at plagiarism and academic honesty, I'd like to begin by considering the idea, or specifically the academic idea. First, foremost, and most importantly, the academic idea always comes from a source. To clarify, it is always tied to a source. This is because academic ideas are only important if they're part of a larger conversation. To academia and the scholarly world, ideas have currency and significance if those are part of the conversation that are being had in the field that the idea comes from. If that conversation isn't happening, generally it's because of the fact that the idea has already been dealt with, or perhaps there's something about the state of the field that means that the idea just isn't relevant yet. To take this a step further, ideas and the discussion of them are only credible if tied to credible sources. And generally speaking, those credible sources tend to be the researchers or experts who are responsible for the idea existing in the specific way it exists. Lastly, our ideas gain support and shape by tying them to credible sources. The support part of that is a way of saying that if we have a particular take on the information or subject matter that we're looking at, the best way to show that that take or interpretation of it is accurate is to base that interpretation on what someone who knows better has said themselves, right? If we can tie our interpretation of subject matter to an expert, that's a really good way of showing that we're making good sense of the thing too. Further, maybe we go beyond just finding someone to agree with what we're saying and actually find someone whose ideas help us to give shape to our own ideas. That's an even better way of showing that the way that we're interpreting things is actually a good and believable and useful way. To sum all this up, this means that it's almost impossible to take part in the academic enterprise without having to confront the question of academic honesty and plagiarism, the way that we understand these things, how they relate to each other, and their position in academia. It's simply necessary, and if we're not thinking about the way that plagiarism and academic honesty affect what we're doing, there's a really good chance that we're going to make a really big mistake. Because of this, the vast majority of schools have policies regarding plagiarism and academic honesty. In terms of SUNY Erie, that policy is within the Student Code of Conduct. It's pretty simple. It's a two-strike system whereby the first time you're caught plagiarizing, the likelihood is good that you'll fail that course. If there's a second time, however, that's grounds for expulsion, and actually the SUNY Erie policy is a particularly lenient one. Most other schools actually have the one-strike policy instead, where the first time you're caught, they might just kick you out of the entire school. The idea of plagiarism exists in the non-academic world as well, and generally speaking, this is in the term of copyright and intellectual property. Copyright laws, I think, are ones that we're all familiar with. These are the sorts of laws that govern, say, books and film and music and other things that we can't just copy because we like the sound of and call it our own. Copyright is the thing that protects the rights of the original writers and filmmakers and artists. That's not to say, though, that that's a black and white world. There's been a particularly good example of that the last 20 to 30 years. There's a band called The Verve and a song called Bittersweet Symphony. Catchy song, well written, good lyrics. The problem, though, is that someone made the argument that too much of a particular song by the Rolling Stones is sampled in the Verve Bittersweet Symphony song. As a result, for years, no radio station would touch it because they didn't want to be part of a legal dispute. That legal dispute was just settled a little while ago, but as I said, that whole dispute is because of the way that at the beginning the artists understood sampling from or borrowing from a different artist in one way, but after that someone else made an argument that actually the borrowing was too much, or at least not fair. A last way in which plagiarism concerns exist in the real world. Our current Democratic presidential nominee, Joe Biden, is unfortunately known for having plagiarized much of his speech a number of years ago in an earlier presidential run. Since then, he has not been caught plagiarizing per se. However, and unfortunately, he is often looked at quite closely just in case he's doing it again. And this gives us an important thing worth remembering, that plagiarism follows the plagiarist. If we are ever caught, even if it's only one time, and even if we're in a school with a two-strike policy, pretty much everything that we create afterwards will be looked at with a very, very strong microscope. So we want to make sure not to do it. There is another side of plagiarism, and it's one that only one person brought up, but I'm glad that somebody did. And this is self-plagiarism, or at least maybe call it paper recycling, which makes a little bit more sense. I understand the rationale here. I think the idea is usually, well, I wrote this, therefore it's mine, therefore I can use it again. The problem is this: once a piece of academic work has been handed in and exchanged for the grade that you get, the thing is effectively spent. The metaphor, the analogy that I like to use for this is stopping at Tim Hortons for coffee on the way to work or school or anywhere else. Right? One day you pull up, you order, you go to the window, pay your money, get your coffee, and that's it for that day. We can't go there the following day and say to the person at the window, well, I paid you yesterday, give me my coffee today, right? The money you paid is spent. If you want new coffee, you pay new money. That's probably the best way I've got of explaining why it is that this paper recycling thing is problematic. Like I said before, you take the new academic work and use it to pay for or exchange for the grade you get. We can't use that academic work to exchange more than once, otherwise, we're basically cheating the person we're getting the grade from. I have over the years thought about the way that we actually have to develop a set of tools for dealing with outside sources to avoid plagiarism, and I refer to that set of tools as QPS, or quote, paraphrase, and summarize. What that means is that anytime we bring information in from an outside source, we've got to think about that as being a three-step process. In the quotation process, we think about the point that we need to make, and then we take the wording from the outside source that helps to make that point. We try not to take any more than necessary because, of course, the more quotation we take, the more time we're going to have to spend showing why it is that we took that. After we've decided exactly what wording from the outside source works for the point we're making, the paraphrase, or P part of that, is where we take the quotation and we put it into our own words in as straightforward a way as possible. The idea here is that it's helping us to sort of bridge the gap between the quote and its original form and the version of it that we need to make the point that we're making. Once we've paraphrased, and it's also worth saying there that paraphrase maintains the original structure, it just uses your words instead of the original words. The last thing we do is summarize, and the summary portion of it is where we show the reader exactly what the point is that we're looking to take away from the source. Right, so QPS, quote, paraphrase, summarize. It guarantees that the reader understands exactly where the quotation is coming from, how much quotation there is, why that amount of quotation is there, how we're using it, and what the idea is that we're taking away. Please, I do recommend make sure that you're spending enough time with any outside quotation, that all of these things are important and all of these things are as clear to your reader as they can be. I'm going to take the final portion of this short discussion this morning and talk a little bit about the way that any discussion of plagiarism and academic honesty is almost immediately in culturally charged terms or culturally charged beliefs. In the vast majority of posts, I saw that people were talking about plagiarism as a moral concept, as a form of exploitation. Some of you were talking about it in terms of self-confidence and self-respect. I saw a few people talking about this with the term integrity, and in one particular case, I saw somebody talking about the way that plagiarism is cheating, and it's not just cheating the teacher or other authority, but actually cheating oneself. All these things seem pretty straightforward and pretty plausible, but that's because of the way that if we're in this course, in general, we tend to share the same cultural background. To say, though, that all of these things are more or less consistent across the same culture is to ignore the fact that different cultures are going to think about these things in different ways. This is exactly why I've asked you to, in preparation for the end of this week, take a look at, among other things, the article on cultural relativism. I'm going to point out a couple of important ideas from that article because, like I said earlier, I'm working on making the case here in the final portion of my discussion for thinking about cultural relativism as a way of explaining why it is that not everybody understands plagiarism in quite the same way. Number one, the author of the article points out that cultural relativism, or really any relativism, has two key features. First, it asserts that one thing is relative to a particular framework. In other words, moral values, knowledge, or meaning comes from the framework of the individual subject, their era, their culture, their language, right? So if we take one particular part of what one person knows, you can't really understand that part without thinking about those external frameworks. Further, these different kinds of relativism deny that any one standpoint is uniquely privileged over all others. In other words, because we all come from different cultures, it doesn't make a lot of sense to assume that one simply knows everything best. To that end, then, the author of the Cultural Relativism article writes that indeed different cultures have different criteria for rationality, that is, for making judgments about what is true, real, or good. And unfortunately, this is the root of all the wars we've ever fought. This is the root of all sorts of friction between cultures and nations across the world. Unfortunately, this is also the root of prejudice and other beliefs that make it hard for people from different cultures to get to know each other. In the end, it can be really hard to explain why it is that we simply believe something, not because we've decided that the person we're talking to doesn't pardon me, deserve the explanation, but instead because those beliefs can be so firmly rooted in our culture that it's never really presented itself to us before as something that we have to explain. The article on cultural relativism, though, does point out that there's a particular position that people have adopted before that I suppose gives us a way of responding to all of these cultural relativistic beliefs. And it's pretty simple. People of the conservativist or just conservative position argue some things are just bad, and we have to see them as just bad. Otherwise, we leave people open to becoming victims and to having sort of crimes and other things perpetrated upon them. Right? So, as a way of counterbalancing these cultural relativist beliefs, we do have to kind of keep in mind that we have to maintain some things as just bad, otherwise, perhaps we open up the world to even worse things than we've ever considered. I realize that's been a fairly long discussion. I prefer to keep them a little bit shorter, but there were some important ideas there. So please give this a consideration as you read over the article on cultural relativism and you begin taking a look at the article on different understandings of plagiarism. And we'll do more discussion in the coming days and weeks of the way that these two ideas might inform each other and help us to see them a little bit better. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.